I'm glad that we have a chance to talk to you before next week's Charleston Conference. To give our viewers a little background, we've arranged this interview to be able to do that. So let's get started by just getting a little bit of your background. I know you've been at the University of Denver for 21 years, which is a marvelous record. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your background and your perspectives today.
Sure. Yeah. 21 years is hard to believe that I've been there for 21 years. I arrived there in 1999 when my wife took a tenure track position as a history professor at University of Colorado, Denver. And I took a temporary 1-year position at the University of Denver and then somehow never left. I think a combination of luck and being in the right place at the right time. It was initially a reference job, and then the head of collection development retired in 2003, and I applied for and got her job, and realized sort of in the process of filling in for her as an interim and then taking over that job permanently that collection development was really my passion and my main interest in libraries, and was lucky enough to stick at the same place and become an associate dean and then dean over time. There are obviously good and bad things to being in the same institution, but being able to build collections over time and watch those collections grow and sort of understand our user community and understand our consortial community or communities, I think has been beneficial.
Well, related to that, collaboration is really key for all libraries today. Nobody can make it on their own. So what is your sort of philosophy with your experience, both at Denver and you've been very active in the larger library association meetings and groups. Could you speak to the role of collaboration today?
Yeah, sure. And I could probably fill up the entire interview just by talking about collaboration, because I think it's fundamentally important. And you may not know this, but I co-edit a journal called Collaborative Librarianship, which is an open access journal that's focused on sort of every aspect of collaboration in libraries, between libraries and consortia, between libraries and publishers, with partners on campus and so on. And I'll plug that journal and say it's well worth checking out. It's we're just in our 12th year of publication and have published some really good things. And the reason that journal I think is so important is that collaboration is key. We certainly can't expect to do the work that we do alone. And this is true for services, for services that we provide to our campus, for metadata, and for collections. And we have long relied on consortial partnerships for our digital licensing. We I think take it for granted at this point that we can generally get a better deal for our digital collections if we work together. But we need to be thinking much more intentionally about our collaborations for our print collections and for sort of even things like digital digitization projects and institutional repositories and so on. I'm on the executive committee of the Western Regional Storage Trust, West, and have devoted a lot of time and thought to West and to shared print generally over the last decade or so. And in many ways, those sorts of programs are the model for what we need to be thinking about for our print collections more generally in terms of collaboration. We need to think about how to ensure that we protect the print resources we've already invested in, and that we, as we continue to build print collections, we're doing so as part of a network and thinking about the collective collection, and not just thinking about our own library. And sort of during COVID, the value of the print collection for immediate access has clearly declined, and hopefully it will recover to some extent when we come out of this. But I think it demonstrates that the most important thing for immediate access is our digital collection, and that as we think about the print collection, we should be thinking about it collaboratively and thinking about how the collections that I build at the University of Denver relate to the collections that somebody else builds at the University of Colorado, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Along with collaboration, or sort of the flip side of that to some extent, is leadership. And not just collaborating with people and getting together and agreeing to things, but particularly as you're managing out to your university there and to others, you've got to show leadership. Could you comment on that a little bit about how you handle that role?
Sure. I'll say that in many ways my experience as collections librarian, where your job is to manage the library collections. And this is true, I think, in most places, right? Your job is to manage the library collections. And most of the people who make the individual collection decisions, the selectors, don't actually report to you, right? And yet you're responsible for those decisions as the collections librarian. And so I think that that's a really good position for preparing anybody for a leadership position, because you have to persuade selectors to make decisions that may or may not be the decision that they would have made otherwise. And you then have to communicate about that decision to campus. You have to sort of coordinate decisions across multiple departments. You have to back up those decisions, even if maybe those aren't the decisions that you directly would have made. So it's I think a good way of sort of building leadership skills and building communication skills, which are such an important part of leadership. In terms of sort of the broader campus and the role of the library dean, especially I think in a time when the library is changing so dramatically, the job is to communicate to campus what the library can and should be doing, but also then communicate back to the library faculty and staff about what the changing expectations and the changing opportunities are for the library. So I guess I keep bringing up communication, right? And I wasn't actually thinking about communication being synonymous with leadership when I was starting to respond to this, but in many ways that really is the key aspect of leadership, is being able to communicate and persuade and understand.
Thank you. Courtney?
I think that your point about communication just really resonates, especially now with so many changes happening in higher education, people trying to be leaders the best way they can in very stressful circumstances. When it comes to communicating about the changes to the collections in particular, have you found any kind of recurring motifs or talking points that help make it more salient? If we're looking at cuts, if we're looking at redistributing, the spends, how have you found some useful strategies in this about communicating collections decisions?
Yeah. That's a really good question, and in some ways, I think it's dependent on whatever collection change or collection issue you're trying to communicate about, what works best. And so I'll start by just giving an example of one that's actually worked really well. Years ago, we were trying to do a shared print program within the Colorado Alliance, and the idea was to buy fewer copies of more titles across across the group. And I always use Shakespeare as my example for this, right? And I don't actually have any idea how many books on Shakespeare are published a year, but let's just say that there are 100 to keep them to keep the story easy. So there are 100 books on Shakespeare published every year, and my library buys 22 of them, and the University of Colorado at Boulder buys 35 of them, and so on. And maybe of those 22 that we buy, 17 also get bought by the University of Colorado at Boulder. All of us buy books on Shakespeare. There are pretty few libraries that wouldn't buy at least a few books on Shakespeare every year. We, of course, want to buy the best books on Shakespeare, but generally speaking, if there's a university press book on Shakespeare, it's probably a book that you want. And yet we can't buy all of them. And so I talked to our faculty, the university faculty, our library advisory committee, and I tried to get them to buy into this idea of us not buying necessarily the same books we would have bought in the past. And it wasn't actually working that well. And then I said, I used the Shakespeare example and said, wouldn't it be better if instead of there being only 45 or 50 of these Shakespeare books within the state of Colorado, wouldn't you rather have there be 80 of them, even if you had to wait? And the University of Denver will still buy 22 of them a year. It just won't be exactly the same 22. And that was actually really effective. And our faculty seemed to like that particular message. And so it was. It's explaining a choice that the library is making, and explaining that they might actually lose something, but they ultimately gain, right? They gain more access. We've tried to explain demand-driven acquisition to them. So obviously there's a little bit of concern about, we're not going to own this book, but wouldn't, and again, if you're an academic, wouldn't you rather have access to 100 books on a particular topic than have us buy 2 books on that particular topic? I think harder to communicate are things where you're actually taking away, right? And that is, obviously much more challenging, and we're facing that right now. We're having to cut things. We have a collections cut, as probably every library in North America has, or every library in the world probably has a cut to their collections budget right now. So we're cutting things, and we're trying to communicate to campus. We're trying to make it clear that we don't want to cut things that are heavily used. We don't want to cut things that are not duplicated in some way. But you have to make tough choices. And I was just talking yesterday about whether it's a good idea or a bad idea to bring the cost into those communications, right? And we had one example where we were trying to cut something that a department uses, not heavily, but they use it. It's duplicated in many ways. So they could use other things to do 90% of what they do in this particular resource. And they were sort of pushing back until we said, it's $11,000 a year. And they were what, flabbergasted, right? They had no idea. So sometimes just bringing in the cost is good. The key I think is to be really transparent about your reasoning, to share usage data when you can, to try to offer alternatives when you can, right? To explain what is and is not still available within the collections, or freely available in some cases, but to be as open and transparent as possible.
I can see how transparency would be really, really key there for sure. I was really interested in your earlier comment about watching the collection evolve over the time that you spent at the University of Denver, and kind of connecting this to the access versus ownership model that you're talking about now with your local community. It seems there's just a lot of inherent pressure between, this impulse to, we have to make cuts, we have to conserve resources, but yet we want to build collections for the future and have them be sustainable and holistic. It can be kind of challenging to navigate that tension, the immediate versus the long-term needs of researchers and the community. Are there any particular strategies that you've seen just kind of in the information industry as a whole that you think have been especially effective in trying to manage that duality?
Yeah, it's a tough one, and I think it's fundamentally important. And I've tried to think through, in terms of prioritizing decisions within the collections. I've tried to think through what our mission is as a library, and what we're trying to do with our collections. So this is overly simplistic, but you can in some ways break down the reason for the collections into two very broad categories. One is to serve the teaching and learning needs of the institution, and you could throw research in there actually, and the other is to preserve for the long term, and you can provide what you need for. So if you ignore the fact that the long term need serves that purpose too, right? So obviously, if I have something 20 years from now, I'm helping students learn. I'm helping faculty research. But if you think it through just that simply, I can help the students who are here today without owning anything, right? They don't need me to own anything. I don't have to have perpetual access rights. I don't need to worry about the future if my goal is just to help today's students. And that has actually been really helpful in sort of thinking through how do you balance those two needs, because obviously you do need to build collections for the future. You do need to make sure that the student who arrives 25 years from now has something, but sometimes you don't need perpetual access or ownership as much as you maybe thought you did or we thought we did in the past. And we've tried to, certainly if it's cheaper to own it, then that's an easy decision. If it's the only way to get access to it, that's an easy decision. But there's some stuff in the middle where you can sort of think that through, like, is this something that I can reasonably provide without investing in perpetual access? And some of it is this thing going to still be, is this particular resource or set of resources going to matter in 5 or 10 years? Is there another way to get access to it in 5 or 10 years? Is the usage of it going to decline dramatically over that time period? Or is there potential to? And then I think really importantly, is it being preserved? And going back to that collaboration question that we started with, one way to think about it is to think locally about access and to think collaboratively and collectively about preservation, right? Making sure that we are preserving things by working in networks of libraries, whether that's a state network or a regional network or a national network.
Excellent. Awesome. Nancy, I believe you had some questions.
Yes, I do. That's a wonderful comment that you made, Michael. I really appreciated that the tensions as well as the opportunities that brings. In 2014, you published an article in Portal that was called Everything, and then subtitled Building the Future Academic Library Collection. Do you think we're on track to really achieve some form of equitable collections, an equitable future? You've touched on it in some of your comments already, but a little bit more directly.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so a truly equitable future for collections would be that everybody has access to everything. And there's probably only one way to get there, which is open access. And I don't know that we're on track to, I mean, as much as I want us to be there, and as much as I hope we get there, it does seem unlikely that everything will be open at any point, right? There are enough reasons why individual titles or individual types of material will never be open, or maybe they'll maybe when everything published, up to today enters the public domain, we'll have gotten to the point where everything is open, but it's going to be, it's going to be a long time. And so I think that the first part of that question is really thinking through what can be open and how far can we get to open access to, and just to keep it simple, to scholarly material, right?
There's two other issues. Certainly one is technology, and technology changes all the time, and not just changing meaning more stuff, but the rules and the control of technology is changing, as we see what's happening right now with Google and some of the other ones. I believe Google is planning to invest $1 billion, they said this week, into content. But the other one has to do with the discoverability, particularly of some of those other voices that have not been heard, voices that have not been a part of the discussions. So when we talk about everything, I was just wondering if you could maybe comment on how you see some of these issues.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. We traditionally have privileged particular voices in our collections, right? We have privileged the voices of whoever could get peer reviewed, and whoever could get published in a particular set of presses. And that is overwhelmingly traditionally white men, less so white women, and voices from minoritized communities within the academy, of course, to some extent. But then if you think about minoritized voices outside of the academy, those don't get published at all, or certainly not in the venues that academic libraries are collecting. And there's a huge challenge there in thinking through how do we make the right investments to make sure that we're acquiring those resources, or that we are representing those voices and communities in our discovery systems, right? They may not be things that we have to collect, but we have to have access to them in some way. And then working with communities to help preserve that material in cases where these are resources that can't be acquired physically because they are part of that community. So I think there's a lot of work to do there, and what it means ultimately is making decisions about what to not invest in that we've invested in the past, so that we can reinvest in this work. And going back to the idea of fewer copies of more titles, or to the idea that we need to work collectively to preserve, right? By spreading out our work, by making sure that we are buying fewer copies of more titles, we can collaboratively make sure that we are preserving and providing access to a wider range of voices, and that's really important to do. And we have we have a responsibility to our current students and to our students and faculty in the future to make sure that we are providing collections that document the experience and the research of as broad a range of communities as possible. Because if we don't collect and preserve, then we sort of perpetuate what we've inherited, which is collections that are overwhelmingly documenting the majority voice in this country.
I want to ask one more question. This just came up. Monday's New York Times talked about how Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, has decided to, this year, they're not going to admit any new doctoral candidates in sociology, anthropology, those were my areas when I was at Minnesota, and art history. So all of this, there's another bubble going on here, and that's what's happening in the larger academy. Would you be willing to kind of comment on how you see what's happening in that larger view?
You know, and I think in that same New York Times article, that they also talked about programs getting sort of shuttered at universities and colleges across the country. The other piece that wasn't in that article, and I'm not going to remember which institution it was, but there was a university that announced recently that they are only going to admit students to a particular doctoral program. I don't remember if it might have been American Studies, but it might have been history. But they were only going to admit students who were studying sort of the experiences of marginalized groups. Right? So they were not going to admit somebody if they were going to study the history of I don't know, of modern France, right? So there's something interesting going there too, right? That there are some, the story from Berkeley, which is we're not going to admit anybody to these programs, but this other institution that was going to really target and make a clear decision on how they want to influence the future study of whichever discipline it was that they represent. Both of those are in some ways problematic because that decision was made for good intent, but based on the fact that there are very, very limited resources, right? And that they can't afford to admit students across everything, and they're gonna target it. That's worrisome for the sort of the future of the academy in a number of ways, right? The production, well, I mean, you could argue it just balances out and corrects the number of PhDs that are being granted because half of all PhDs every year end up not getting a job in a tenure track position at a university. So you could argue that. I'm not going to make that argument because I think that decreasing the pipeline isn't good. Decreasing the pipeline probably means that, well, it overall means for sure that there's less opportunity. If there's less opportunity, it means that that maybe it becomes even more selective. There was something I read at some point that 8% of, or eight graduate programs account for something like 80% or 70% of all the history, I think it was, candidates hired in North America, right? Some crazy number. Because if you get a PhD from certain institutions, you're almost certainly going to get a job. And if you get a PhD from other institutions, you're going to struggle getting a job. And if this helps just make that, and Berkeley might actually be one of those 8 institutions, but if this is what's happening, it sort of makes it even harder for people who have not traditionally been represented in academia to get a job. So that's worrisome, and it's certainly worrisome if it decreases the resources that are there to support those programs, right? To bring it back to libraries, if we then get a cut because that program has been cut in some ways, then it just perpetuates the problem. So it's very worrisome. I mean, and I think is just part of this larger worry about the health of higher education over the next 5 to 10 years anyway.
Thank you. I definitely appreciate your comments there. Next week, you're doing a conference presentation with Jason Price of the California Electronic Library Consortium and EBSCO's John McDonald. Can you give us a sense of what you'll be talking about, what the presentation, so we can kind of get all excited about this?
So we're giving a presentation about Unsub, and for those of you who don't know what Unsub is, it's a really powerful tool that allows you to understand the impact of a cancellation or of a change in a big deal, right? So to use Unsub, you load your counter JR1 for Elsevier or Wiley or Springer into, and so far those are the only publishers that are working in Unsub. So you load your counter JR1, and then you input a lot of information about your big deal, and then it sort of spits out data that can help you. So Unsub tells you the titles that are most used and what the impact on your interlibrary loan costs would be, what the open access availability is, what the backfile availability is, and so on. If you make a change, and there's a slider that you can go up or down, and you can understand sort of what the cost is going to be if you choose to cancel a certain number of titles, which is great, and is really potentially very powerful. But there are a number of assumptions, I think, that are baked into that system that need to be picked apart. And so John and Jason and I are trying to pick apart those assumptions and test those assumptions. And we've plugged in data from a number of different libraries so that we can understand with real contracts for a real Elsevier big deal what the impact on libraries will be. And then we've also said, all right, if I change this parameter within Unsub, what happens? If I change the assumptions that Unsub is making or that I as a librarian am making, what happens, and what would be the outcome for my users? So the hope is that we can help make this already powerful tool a more powerful tool, and that we can help librarians use it as effectively as possible with a really clear understanding of what the assumptions they're making are, and how those assumptions impact a potential decision to either cancel or break up a big deal.
Courtney?
Sounds like a wonderful presentation. I'm really excited about it. Before we close, is there a question you feel maybe we should have asked that we haven't?
I was just assuming you were going to ask at some point about about COVID and what that meant for libraries. And so,
if you have thoughts on that, I'm eager to hear them.
I'm thinking a lot about it, and actually, I wrote something for Nancy to share in Against the Grain about this. But it's, this is another topic that you could probably go on for an entire hour about. But we are, I think clearly we're going to come out of this, if and when we come out of this, with a changed set of sort of assumptions about the library and the library's role on campus and the role of collections and the use of collections. And it's something that I think we all need to be thinking through really carefully. Just a couple of thoughts on that. We suddenly in March, we had no access to our print collections at most universities across North America, right? They were suddenly completely inaccessible. And, we gradually brought them back, most of us with curbside checkout. Some have opened up more broadly than that. But we spent a period with no access to our print collections, and our faculty and our students had to get used to using digital. I think libraries, you can imagine that libraries are on a spectrum from really, really heavily digital to really heavily print. And I think those who were further behind on moving to digital had a lot of catch up to do. But everybody, even if you already were pretty heavily invested in digital and were heavily preferred, I think as an institution, you moved even further towards digital, and none of us are going to move back, right? We'll move back maybe a little bit, but nobody's going to move entirely back. And our faculty who hated ebooks, and have told us over and over how much they hate ebooks, even though we have data that show that they use them, have had to use them, and maybe will appreciate them more. And I think that the role of print in how we think about our collections and how our communities think about our collections is changing, and that has a lot of sort of trickle effects on how we think about the space in the main library, how we think about our storage facilities, how we think about our future investments in collections. So that's just one example of how I think we're going to be changed completely. But there are equally large impacts on our services and on our spaces and on sort of every piece of the library. And we're gonna need to be proactive in coming out of this, in sort of driving the library and our services and our collections and our investments in ways that we think make sense before those things sort of get pushed on us, right? We don't want to come out and suddenly find that a particular service that we could have moved in a way that makes sense for this post-COVID world. We don't want to try to move it back to what it used to be and then find that we lose that service entirely. So I think it's really important that we be thinking about what the 2-year and 5-year horizon is for the changes that we need to be making, that in many ways we're living right now, and what do we carry forward as we hopefully, knock on wood, come out of this.
I love that phrase, driving the library, both kind of future oriented and active instead of passive. It's, I think, a really key observation. Thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your insights and thoughts with us. It's been a real delight to hear from you, and we're looking forward to your upcoming session. I'm sure the topic will resonate with a lot of libraries dealing with the collections budgets, cuts, and all of the other disruptions that COVID has brought into our world. So I'm sure it will be very well attended, very well watched, and we just thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah,
yes, thank you, Michael. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, thanks again. I really enjoyed it, and I wish we could have been doing this on the top floor of the Francis Marion.
Same.
We were about to go walk down King Street, but hopefully
next year.
Yes.
We'll
absolutely.
do that next year.
Next year will just be extra celebratory. It will just have that, additional layer of specialness.
Yes.
This is what I need to tell myself.
Yeah.